not a theological seminary. I was teaching, as some of you may know, basically two groups of students. I was teaching a 3-year program to men and women who had no theological training, and so they were coming for the 3-year program in order to learn to become pastors. I was also teaching many students who had taken a certificate course and had been evangelists and or pastors and were coming to upgrade or further their education at best. Where I taught mostly biblical courses, Intro to Old Testament, Intro to New Testament, Genesis, Psalms, Isaiah, the literature of John, Synoptic Gospels. And I have a question to ask all of you. How many of you have studied and are familiar with a second language other than your native language? How many have studied a second language? Got all these people who are missionaries. Folks from Ethiopia. So how many of you have studied a third language? We lose a few. All right. Well, I've only studied, I guess I've studied a couple. Really, yeah. So imagine, if you can, that we do the rest of this lecture in your third language. Okay, good. That's what I read. We're not that language literate. That's good. Because that's what my students were doing. They are all Oromo, and so Oromo is their native language. Because Amharic is the national language, they are learning that. But I was doing all my teaching, along with my Ethiopian colleagues. We were teaching in English. And so all of my students are listening to my lectures in their third language. And that proved real interesting for me as I began at my first year. Because we've done language study in Addis, and so Carolyn Weber and some other European missionaries had shared with me the fact that, keep in mind, Steve, you're going to discover that your students' English is very poor, very bad, and so you'll have to adjust to that. And you can be told that, but then actually going to my first day of class and preparing my lecture, I discovered, it's even worse than I could imagine. Because I prepared some study guides, and I realized very quickly that those weren't going to work. Thankfully, my wife, who is a teacher, had told me, don't prepare too many, because you may find that they don't work very well, and they didn't. And so I had to go back and restructure it and basically give a study guide that was pretty much a synopsis of the notes of my lecture that I was going to teach to them each day, and that proved a little bit more effective as I then continued to teach that year. The other thing I discovered that I was thankful for, and didn't realize that this would be important, but for 30 years I had been a pastor, and I had been a pastor who had done children's messages for my kids before they went downstairs. And I found that I was reverting back to sharing object lessons in order to explain to my students some theological concept, to be able to help them to better understand the English words, phrases, and ideas that I was giving to them. I enjoyed teaching my first year. One other thing that I learned quickly that first year was that because the English language was difficult for them, particularly when it came to me giving written assignments, there was a tendency among some of my students to sort of share their work. And so I had to teach them that first semester, and then next year I made it part of my introductory to actually teach them how to, as individuals, write a paper. There's a cultural difference there. For Americans, we would never think of, oh, my wife says, yes, they do. She teaches. We might, but we would know that that would not be right, that we would consider that as Americans cheating, copying off our neighbor's paper. But I had to share with them that in the academic realm that we could do that. And so I had some early discussions with students and said, why did you let me copy your paper? Or in one case, the three of them called them and they not only copied their papers, but their entire paper were copied from a commentary or 2 or 3 commentaries without giving any citation. And so I shared with them. And that was an ongoing process. And I will say that the second year, the students that I had first year who I was then teaching in the second year did show an improvement in that area. But then during the second year, Carol Wilson came from, she's a pastor in Susquehanna Valley Presbyterian, and she came and taught for a semester, came as a volunteer. And so we were able to talk and share. And she presented an interesting question. After being there about 8 weeks, she said, I'm really kind of confused as to why I'm here teaching them theology in English. Why, when they're struggling and it's so difficult for them to be able to comprehend what I'm saying, why aren't they just being taught in their own, on their own language? They would learn so much more than what they're learning from me because of the language barrier, which I hadn't thought about as much my first year. So that led me to having some discussions with some colleagues and with students. And basically they gave me 2 reasons why they felt it was important that these courses be taught in the English language. The first was that if the students were going to do any kind of research or learning on their own, they needed to be able to do that in English because all of the resources are written in English. And that's true. The Idada Bible Seminary, the library, is a very good library. Many works that were donated by Union Theological Seminary in Virginia. It's very well stocked, and of course, it's all in English. And so it was important for them to be taught in English and improve their language skills so that they could do that sort of research. And the second answer that was given to me both by church leaders and students was that if a student was going to go on for any kind of further education, to go to Addis Ababa and get a bachelor's, then all of that would be in English. And so it was important for them to be trained and taught the diploma programs that were being done in the English language. And so those were 2 good points, and those are valid points. The only question as we discussed it, is it was really teaching for the elite within my classes. I was teaching for the 1 out of 10, or 3 out of 30, which is what most of my classes were, who maybe were going to go on to become presidents of synods and other leadership positions. We were teaching them, and they were teaching it in English. But the vast majority of my students were not going to do that. The vast majority of my students only had 10th grade education, and they were going to go back to their home congregations in remote rural areas of western Ethiopia benefited more from their courses if it had been done in their native language. Now, having said that, all my colleagues who were Ethiopians, they were teaching in English. And the benefit that my students said that I brought to them was that because English is my native language, my English was a little bit better than my colleagues, who for them it was their third language. And depending on the quality of their teachers, that affected the quality of their English. And the other thing that they pointed out to me was that my style was a little different from my Ethiopian colleagues, and that I had no problems stopping my lecture and asking if there were questions, and then we would go off track many times and discuss what was important to them. And that was not something that was generally done by my colleagues. They tended to stay on their lecture and simply lecture the whole time. So it was important and valuable for them to have the teaching done in English by me. The positive thing I saw, though, about them being taught in their native language was that was then helpful to them as they seek to minister to their people. And there's a story that proves that point of how important it is that they're able to share the gospel in their own language. We heard a little bit about the Muslims in the RC, and Jesus Church is very active in the RC region and have sought to do evangelistic work over there. And from my understanding from the history I've been given of that project within the Jesus Church, is that initially the evangelistic efforts done did not fare so well because the first representatives from the church were coming in and were preaching and ministering in Amharic, and that did not translate into being able to bring people into the Christian faith. And so the Bethel synods that are over on the west, that are all Oromo synods, they began to do missionary work with the Muslims in the RC region, and they did it, of course, in Oromo, in Afan-Oromo. And that has proved to be, as he shared, all his teachers are from Jesus churches that are being planted and working in the RC region. And so that has been very helpful. And actually, one of the brightest students I had, and if you were on our newsletter list, you've heard a little bit about her, but near to Abraham, was from the RC area. She also was a Muslim as a child, and eventually came to accept Jesus as her Savior, got involved in the church, and got involved in another church. And that was the Jesus Church, and they had sent her from the RC region all the way to Demidolo, which is about 600 miles away from her family, in order for her to study, to go through the 3-year diploma program, become a pastor, and then return and share the gospel with her people. And she too has already been sharing it with her mother, and she also has a stepmother, but her mother has come to Christ, and a couple of her siblings have come to Christ. And so there's great advantage there. It's wonderful to hear about the testaments being placed into RC dialect, because getting the gospel in the hands of people in their own language is crucial for the gospel to spread. I want to close, and then Brenda share at the time, just by saying that over the course of my time teaching there were 2 things that I ended up you are. Most of you would say that you're Americans. You might say, well, I've got some English blood in me. I've got some maybe Scottish blood, French blood, German blood, Irish blood, which would be the closest thing to getting to somebody who's green because of that. But we would say that we are Americans, and we think of ourselves as Americans. And I appreciated your map and pointing out all the different regions, the Oromo, the Tigray, the Amhara, and how you yourself said, I am Oromo, I was Muslim. Because I learned that Ethiopians do not really see themselves as Ethiopians the way we as Americans culturally see ourselves as Americans. They see themselves as Oromo. They see others as Tigray. And that was an interesting cultural thing for me to learn, and how that translated into my teaching, because it came up many times from the students, is that Jesus taught us to love all people, and that Jesus taught us not just to love the Oromos, but we are to love the Tigray, we are to love the Amhara. And there's a lot of tension between the groups, and that was expressed by my students studying to be pastors in an expression of anger towards people that they feel have been oppressive to them. And so just sharing with them that we are all one in Jesus Christ, and that breaks down all barriers, was a constant thing I shared, because it was a constant theme that would be brought. You mean, Teacher Steve, we are to love the Amhara? I said, yes, you are, yes. And the other thing that came up often, and particularly as I dealt with Genesis and the creation of man, is that culturally, women still need to be lifted up to a higher elevation in Ethiopia. My wife will tell you this. She was very surprised that I went to Ethiopia and returned a feminist. There are a lot of still cultural ideas that tend to elevate men over women, and so I shared often that when God created us, He created us male and female. We are men and women. We are all created in His image, and that again, we are not Jew or Greek, male or female, slave or free, but we are all one in Christ Jesus. And so I encourage my students to look upon their sisters in the class as their sisters, but also to help them as they go back to their congregations to try to elevate in the minds of their congregation the role of women and the position of women as it's still maybe a ways to come. So I'm going to turn this over to my
When I often saw some of the positions of missionaries in recent years, I was always very, very happy that I was called to be a teacher, because the role of teacher is easily defined. I knew what was expected of me, and I liked that. Sometimes planners and some of the kinds of the titles people had, I didn't have a clue what they were doing. English teacher is pretty self-explanatory. And I knew from the day I got there what was expected of me and what they had hoped for me. And that was to help my 11th and 12th graders prepare for the national exams so that they could take the exams, so that their lives would be changed. BESS has a wonderful reputation of attracting students who are given the opportunity to go on and their lives do change. And so I knew that I was blessed to be going to a school that had a long heritage of of mission and of helping the people in Ethiopia. I knew that I was very, very blessed. So when they asked me to tell you about my experiences there, I thought I would be telling you things like, Dolo has roads now. When we first moved, we didn't have any roads, and we now have paved roads. Amen. Big time amen. We have bajajas who actually take people places now. When the bajaj starts, or when there's gasoline. I wanted to tell you that we have the boys' dormitory, and the one set of classrooms have new roofs, thanks to SERV, who had all helped, and thanks to EEF, who helped fund that project. My boys, who are living on campus, are not soaked every night during rainy season. I worried about them. It rained as one student said, it rains inside as much as outside, teacher. And I said, yes, and that's not okay. And of course, students get sick that way. So I'm grateful, so grateful for those things. Of course I could, how can I forget? The airport opened again in Dembidolo. So, I mean, I feel like things are happening in Dembidolo to begin to start on a course for modernization. I can, of course, tell you about more roofs that need fixed. I could tell you about holes in walls. I can tell you how the school is worrying about the water situation because the big deep lake that we've always used for our water, the town has now decided they own. And they, when they built these wonderful roads, also laid the groundwork to take the water from the lake into the town. So Bess, who never worried about water, now is starting to worry about water. So I could tell you those things, but truthfully, you know those stories. You know, every one of us has those stories, and I can just change the town. Every town has its own issues. But you see, this is, and by the way, I knew I had made it with my students the day they told me, teacher, you are a Roma. I said, I am a Roma. Every Monday morning, we pray, and I worked really hard. My Afaro is terrible. Garimiti. Garuna Nala, I tried. When I prayed my first prayer, my first complete prayer in Afaro, my students applauded and stood up for me. And I said, bless you, even though I knew I had butchered at least 2 or 3 words. But they're my kids. And even though I'm not there this year, I just am holding them. This time of year is national exam time. And every night I go to bed and I actually think about my 11th graders who are 12th graders. I think about Kenton, and I think about, will she study, will she do well? But I want to tell you about what happened last year, in last year's national exams. Because that brings to light a situation that we don't actually know is happening. I mean, some of you, because you're in the know that there was some struggles with a land situation in Addis Ababa last year, where Addis Ababa wanted to expand into Oromo land, and that's very, very wrong. And usually it's our boys, our teenage boys, they started protesting this unfairness, and they're absolutely right. Up in Bess, in the isolated part of God's heaven, I didn't know this was going on, but many of our boys were not going to school last year. They would go to the school and stand outside of the school and protest and about the unfairness, and as often these things do in other cultures which we don't understand, the government then stepped in and things became violent. Around Christmas time, things were particularly violent. And in Dembidolo, which Dembidolo feels like they are a big part of the oppressed because of a long time ago, violence But that all seemed to settle down, and we all got back to work, and we all got going back on national exams. And that's what's important, because that's what changes lives. And I am a list maker. My family says they've never seen me without a yellow tablet. I'm pretty sure there'll be one in my casket. I made sure, I analyzed those exams, I made sure everything was covered. When national exams are given, teachers are not allowed at the school for fear that we might influence our students. And I mean that because there's a government man with a big rifle standing at this school. And so that means I don't go. I didn't go to school, and I knew that. Many of our faculty were going and proctoring exams in other school districts. They didn't let me go. They said I would be too hard. I was on campus the day of national exams last year, the first day. First exam was the English exam. I knew I had about 10 kids that I knew that had been meeting with me after school that were really, really serious about this. And I expected that at the lunch break, they would be at my house. Mostly I figured they would come with their tests and say, what was this right answer? Or, oh, it was so hard, teacher. Or, what should I have done with this answer? I even made cookies. I was ready for these kids. And at noon, it was very quiet on campus. Too quiet. And I decided I would stick my head out around to see. I didn't want to go to the school, but I wanted to know what was going on. And I looked out on the campus, and the campus should have been covered with 120 kids, eating their lunches, preparing for afternoon exams. There were no kids. 2 11th graders were playing basketball on the basketball court. So I asked them off on the road, where were my students? And they said, we don't know what you're talking about. And I said, where are my students? And then finally I said, where's Isaac? And where's Matos? And where's Gideon? And they said, oh, they're down at the cafeteria, dining club. So I went down there, and there all of my students are standing. And I said, why aren't you having lunch? What's going on? I said, go to your cottage, we'll be there soon. They all came, and they said, teacher, national exams are canceled. I said, what do you mean canceled? We can't cancel national exams, it's across the country. Millions of kids take these exams. Hard kids, D-grade kids, all 12th grade kids take these exams. It's the basis of everything. And they said, a man in the United States from Minnesota, he is from Ethiopia, that he told the Ethiopian government that he wanted the exams postponed for the Oromo boys because the Oromo boys were not as prepared for exams. And he said, the government came back and said, we can't do that. I don't know why. I don't know if it was an anti-Oromo or whether they just felt they couldn't snowball it. But anyways, they said they couldn't. And the man said, well, if you do not, I will shut the exams down. And he did. Sunday night, before Monday morning exams, this man in Minnesota posted on Facebook a copy of the exam, complete with every question, and then his next Facebook page was a copy of all the answers. The government had no alternative but to shut down. Now I will tell you, every one of my students at best showed up at that exam with their cell phone, and on their cell phone, the page with the answers. Now, I'm telling you that, I'm also telling you that every other kid in Ethiopia probably did too. I'm not saying my kids are worse than anybody else, they all came. Except Matos, who sat on my couch, and he said, teacher, I did not. And I said, Matos, you didn't look at the answers? And his friend Isaac sitting next to him said, he looked at the questions, but he wouldn't let us look at the answers. He made us figure them out ourselves. And he My kids who graduated, my 12th graders, they all graduated. National exams is the end, and then they go home. And I was extremely worried. And I said to them, guys, because I had them ready. If you're a teacher, you know that feeling when you know they're ready for the exams. And they're like, oh, we will study. At home, don't worry, we'll study. I'm like, you know, I have 2 sons. I know what that means. And for the very first time, Bess's results weren't very good this year. Now, I imagine that that was true of a lot of kids across the country. I don't have access to those. For the first time, 7 kids didn't even pass the exam. None of my kids got into doctoral programs. And I know it's because they went home and played or said they were studying, but they were talking with their friends or, you know, what teenagers do. So I bring this to your attention because not only do our kids have the problems of not having enough. I mean, many of my students didn't have enough food or didn't have enough clothes or didn't have enough money, but now the outside world is affecting them too. I don't know what we can do about it. I wrote to my youngest son, the school teacher in Hershey, and I said, what can I do? And I said, can my students sue him? And he said, no, they can't, Mother. So I wrote to Facebook. I told them what he'd done. They wrote back and told me, we're sorry you feel this way. If you feel this way, unfriend the man. Well, we weren't friends to begin with. But I want you to know that our kids have a lot of things already on their plates, you know, and I'm sure that this person in America thought that he was doing something wonderful. I mean, I see that there are more than one side to every issue. But my kids, and lots of kids, were hurt by it. And so as we continue to pray for the physical needs that kids have over there, I'm just asking that you keep in mind and pray for the outside world that affects them too. As a teacher, I was extremely indignant and upset because I can only see it from the point of view of what happens best for my kids. But before I leave you on, I'll leave you on a good note. I want to tell you about a young man who he was from the eastern part of Ethiopia, and there was a famine a few years back, and the government did what the government does. It moved his family to Dambidolo, where they knew no one. And Dambidolo is quite a cliquish little town, and no one would hire his father because they didn't know him. And after 2 years, his family said, we're moving back to the east, where our family is, where we can get help and we can have a job. And this young man said, no, I want to stay in Dambidolo. I want to go to a good school. I want to go. He obviously didn't know what was going on, did he? Maybe this was a little before his that. And he said, I want to go to Best. And he sat, and my principal told me, and he would go every day to school, and then he would sit outside the gate at Best. And every day, the principal would come and he'd say, Mohammed, go home. We don't have any more scholarships this year. We don't have any room for any more students. And Mohammed came every day and sat outside the gate. And he said, I need to go to Best. He said, I need to go to Best. So finally, one day, Emmanuel said, we're going to go to Best. He said, I don't have any money for you to live in the dorm. He said, but I will pay your tuition. So the first year that Mohammed was in Best, he was living at home and going to school at Best. I met Mohammed when he was in 11th grade, and I knew right away he was a smart kid. But he was also one of those kids who didn't show up. And he was always one of those kids that a teacher looks and says, if he would just be here, he would be the top of the class. And I would ask him, and I'd said, Mohammed, why aren't you here? Sometimes in Oromo, sometimes in English. And he would say, teacher, it's a social problem. Don't worry. I'm like, what does that mean? So finally, he missed 7 days before the final exam. He showed up on the day of the final exam in my class, and I thought, he's never going to pass. And I took him aside, and this time I said, you've got to tell me what's going on. You can't pass this exam. I don't want to give it to you today. And he started to cry. And I had to call the assistant principal because my Oromo is not that good. Much better than this one's, but not that good. And so the assistant principal came and we started to find out. And Muhammad's family had gone back to the east. And at first he had been staying with friends, but those friends left. And the last 2 years, Muhammad had been living wherever he could find a place to live. And when he missed school, it was because someone who had hired him as a day laborer so that he would have some money for food. And sometimes he just didn't even have the energy to have food. And so I said to him, how many days has it been since you ate? And he didn't want to answer. And I said, tell me how many days. And he said, 3. I said, go to my house. I said, Casey is there. That's what they call Steve. Casey is there. I said, he will feed you. The assistant principal said, he can't do that. He can't do that. How will he know he's just not some baker? I said, we have been married 30 years. He will know if I sent them that he should feed this boy. So we took him and we fed the kid. And when we started giving him, we had to do it in a way that made him feel like we were going home for a month. This food will be ruined. Can you not eat it, use it? And we made sure that Muhammad had a place in the dorm the next year, which is not a lot. But the following year, I saw Muhammad. He was in school every day. One day after school, he didn't know. He doesn't know. To this day, I don't think he knows that I did Steve and I did this. He says to me, I love it. He says to me, teacher, my belly is full. He said, my belly is full. I can think about school. Now, he was eating the dining club where my son, please ask me, he said, please never make me eat there again. I said to him, cafeteria food is cafeteria food. I'm sorry. What we do matters. Muhammad's life is changed. What we do matters.